Okay, good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to tonight's webinar put on by Collaborative Practice Solutions in conjunction with TLD Systems. Tonight we're going to be speaking about HIPAA security and what you need to know and why it's important for your compliance with meaningful use in 2016 and just in general. Tonight we're very lucky to have Dr. Michael Brody, the owner of TLD Systems, who is by far one of the nation's experts when it comes to HIPAA security and your security risk analysis. My name is Dr. Alan Bass. I'm a senior healthcare consultant with Collaborative Practice Solutions. How you doing, Michael?
Fine, thank you.
There he is.
No,
He's on mute.
No, I'm here now.
There we go. Just a little bit of housekeeping that we always like to cover before we get started. All the information is current as of today. And like always, the webinar is being recorded and will be available in just a couple of days on the TRAKnet YouTube channel. Like usual, all the attendees are in listen-only mode. And there you have two ways to ask some of your questions. You'll have the ability to type them right into the question pane. And because we have such a large amount of material to cover this evening, I'm probably not going to interrupt Michael to cover any questions on the fly. But once we finish up, we're going to take that document, and between Michael and I, we're going to make sure all your questions get answered, and we'll get that posted on the Collaborative Practice Solutions website under our FAQs like we do with all of our webinars. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michael and let him take us through HIPAA security, everything that you need to know from top to bottom. Michael, take it away.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you for that kind introduction. We're going to talk about the HIPAA security rule and really not so much what your staff needs to do, but what you need to understand about it and why it's important for your practice. And we're doing this from a high level so that way you get understanding. Now, Alan mentioned that if you have any questions, type them in the question pane. Question pane's in your control panel. If you have questions, type them as we go, because we're going to go through a lot, and if you wait until the end to type or write up your questions, you may forget what they are. So I encourage you to type them in as I go through the presentation, and I'll try to answer as many online as time allows, and any that we cannot get to, as Alan said, we will develop an FAQ that will be on the Collaborative Practice Solutions website. Just as disclaimer, I am the CEO of TLD Systems. We've helped hundreds of practices implement their HIPAA security risk analysis. I'm the Chief Compliance Officer for SAMI. I'm a Health Information Technology Consultant for PICA, and I sit on many of the committees that make these rules that we have to deal with. So luckily I'm here and you cannot throw tomatoes at me through the computer screen. Next slide, please. Now, what you need to understand is you can do this. This is not something that you need to be scared of. It's something that's well within your reach. And HIPAA compliance is what the government calls flexible and scalable. You are responsible under the federal regulations to do everything that is within your resources to do to protect the patient information that you are entrusted with. So you don't have to spend tens of thousands of dollars or jump through hoops that are beyond your resources. You simply have to utilize what is available to you to protect your patient's records. Next slide, please. What we want to do here is help you to understand how to utilize the technology that's available to you and the resources available to you to implement HIPAA security. Next slide, please. The bottom line is, and if you really want to go and double check what I'm saying, if you go to the Federal Register and look at page 8335, and you have the patients to read through the government speak, you'll understand what I'm saying and you'll see where it is, and you'll be able to verify everything I'm providing to you. Next slide, please. Bottom line is this. At the end of this presentation, you're going to understand what is possible for you to do, and you're going to be able to do it. And you'll be able to be compliant with the HIPAA regulations such that if anyone ever comes in your audit office to audit you, you'll be in good shape. Next slide, please. The idea of HIPAA is to take the steps to minimize the possibility of an event in your office. Even with the best HIPAA security plan, things can go wrong. Even our government gets hacked and people break into it. Everyone saw during the election the episodes where email servers were hacked that should have had huge amounts of security on it, with organizations that had a lot more resources than we do as practices. If they can get broken into, we can get broken into despite our best efforts. And the government understands this, and they have a get-out-of-jail-free card. And that get-out-of-jail-free card is, should you have a breach in your office, if you have done a good faith HIPAA security risk analysis and HIPAA risk mitigation plan, and you respond to that breach properly within 30 days, the government by law is not allowed to fine you. Now, when we talk about events, there are HIPAA events and HIPAA violations. Not every HIPAA violation is a breach. A breach is when patient information is seen by somebody who should not. Every breach is a HIPAA violation, but not every HIPAA violation is a breach. And breaches are much more severe types of HIPAA violations than the others, but we will discuss all types of HIPAA violations through the course of this presentation. Next slide, please. A non-breach is when something happens that is not allowed by HIPAA. HIPAA has three components to it. Under HIPAA, you must ensure the availability of your medical records. So if for some reason your medical records are not available to you, that is a HIPAA event. HIPAA ensures the integrity of your medical records. So if something happens where they get corrupted, that is a HIPAA event. There are also patients' rights under HIPAA where they are entitled to certain access to data. And if you do not respect the patient's rights to their access to data, those are also HIPAA events, but none of those are breaches. Next slide, please. Since a breach involves the exposure of patient information, it is actually considered a violation of the patient's civil rights. Should you have a breach in your office, there will be a number of very specific steps that you are going to need to go through as part of your security incident response. And among those are the breach notification procedures. Next slide, please. Breach notification procedures include you are going to have to tell your patient what happened, how it happened, what steps you're taking to minimize the damage, and what information of theirs was exposed. So that is part of the breach notification process. Breaches can happen due to a number of reasons. As you can see here, I have 5 here, and the criminal behavior, the 4th one down, is the one that we hear about the most. That's when a hacker breaks into the system and gets access to tens or hundreds of thousands of patient records. But criminal behavior is one of the less common reasons for HIPAA events and HIPAA breaches. Carelessness is the most common cause of a HIPAA breach. What do I mean by carelessness? Every day in hundreds of doctors' offices, an envelope gets stuffed and the wrong piece of paper is sent to the wrong patient, and a patient receives information in the mail about somebody else. This is a breach of a single patient and a single event. But these breaches of single patients and single events actually add up to result in more patient breaches than those you read about in the newspapers. The ones in the newspapers are large, they are newsworthy, but they're really not the biggest cause of HIPAA breaches. Next slide, please. Now, when we talk about carelessness or negligence, these are things that can easily be prevented with proper staff training and with people knowing what to do. Carelessness and negligence breaches usually happen when you're a little bit rushed, a little bit busy, not paying attention to what you should be doing, and as a result, patient information is seen by somebody who should not. Next slide, please. Other breaches are caused by poor planning. Poor planning can be that you did not do a good HIPAA security risk analysis. You didn't properly understand the risks to the information you have, or you didn't properly train your staff in what their responsibilities are in complying with the HIPAA regulations. We also want to make sure that by doing a proper HIPAA risk analysis and being educated about this, you don't end up with a breach due to poor planning. Next slide, please. Criminal behavior is when somebody actually steals information, either by physically stealing the server, and there have been cases where doctors' offices have been broken into and computers have been physically stolen, or electronically stealing the data by breaking in and being a cyber criminal. It is criminal when somebody tries to do it and their intent is to do harm or make money from the data. Now, a stolen credit card has a value on the black market of about $1 per credit card. Stolen medical records have a value of about $50 per stolen medical record. This makes medical records huge targets for criminals. The reason for that is most of us do a pretty good job of checking our credit card statements each month to make sure that we actually made all the charges we did. Our credit card companies are also pretty good about monitoring what we're doing. And if we start having charges that don't make sense and don't fit our pattern, you'll get a phone call or a text asking, did you make this charge? And the credit card company will stop the card from working if they feel fraud is going on. Health insurance companies do not monitor your claims as closely. They will receive a claim, they will pay a claim, and tens of thousands of dollars of claims can be processed on your health insurance card before anybody notices, because patients do not watch their EOBs as closely as they watch their credit card statements. Next slide, please. Willful neglect is something that you really want to avoid. If you do not make a good faith attempt to be compliant with the HIPAA rules and regulations, you are considered to be in willful neglect of the HIPAA regulations. Should you have a breach, and should the government determine that you were in willful neglect of the HIPAA regulations, they are required by law to fine you. The 30-day get-out-of-jail-free card does not apply, and you do not have that available to you should the government determine that you are in willful neglect. So what you want to do is make sure that you have all the documentation in place to show that you have put in a good faith effort, so that way the government cannot put you into the category of willful neglect should you have a HIPAA violation. Next slide, please. So the bottom line here is that you want to make sure that you're not there. Now, when we talk about a HIPAA security risk analysis, there are a number of important steps to it. You need to look at what data you have, where it's being held. You have to look at the potential threats to that data, and you need to come up with an action plan on how you're going to better protect that data. That action plan is your risk mitigation plan. You then have to follow through and implement that action plan. So if you simply went through the process of documenting and created an action plan but did not follow through with it, you have only given HIPAA lip service, and you could theoretically be found to be in willful neglect. Next slide, please. Now, when we talk about the fines, as I said, should you be in willful neglect, there are fines that are required. You want to make sure that you're not there. HIPAA breaches due to negligence, carelessness, poor planning, as long as you have done a good faith effort, mistakes happen, things go wrong, you have that get out of jail free card. Next slide, please. Your HIPAA security plan has a very important aspect to it that I touched on before, which is the security incident response. Now, you have 30 days from a HIPAA event to properly respond to avoid the fine. That includes you have to identify what happened. You have to go through the breach notification process I mentioned. You have to figure out what you can do to make sure it does not happen again and implement those changes to minimize the chance of it happening again. This has to be properly and thoroughly documented. You want to complete this within 30 days in order to avoid any fines from the federal government. Now, even if you avoid fines from the federal government, you may end up with significant fees associated with your steps that you have to take in the risk mitigation. If you've ever had someone have your data breached, you may have gotten a letter saying you're getting credit monitoring services. So you may have to provide credit monitoring services, which can be expensive. You have to notify every patient who is involved. That involves stamps, printing up things, and the costs associated with that. You're probably going to have to hire a healthcare attorney to help represent you, even if you have the 30 days in, to make sure the government realizes you took this process. That's expensive. So even if you do a HIPAA security risk analysis and you do it properly, I strongly recommend that everybody get cybersecurity insurance that can help you with the costs associated with credit monitoring, patient notification, and hiring an attorney to help you document the entire process. Next slide, please. So can a good HIPAA plan prevent events? No, it cannot. It can only help you to minimize it, and it can help you to minimize your risk of potential fines. When I say minimize the risk of potential fines, if it takes you more than 30 days to address a breach, you could potentially be fined. If it takes you 330 days, the chance of a fine is much higher, and the amount of the fine will be much higher than if it takes you 31 days. So even if it takes you over 30 days, you still want to do this as quick as possible to minimize any potential fines. Next slide, please. There is no way I or any other HIPAA security consultant can guarantee you will not have an event even with our services. We can help you implement practices and procedures that allow you to A, avoid fines and minimize the chance of an event in your office. Next slide, please. We spoke about this a little bit before, but HIPAA is much more than just security. It's availability and confidentiality. It's more than security. It's availability and integrity and patient rights. And you want to make sure, especially with the patient rights, that you protect those patient rights. Patients are a very common cause of HIPAA investigations. The government has instituted what they call a user-friendly website where patients can file complaints about your HIPAA policies and procedures should they feel that you have done something wrong. And since this user-friendly website was established, a lot more complaints are filed on a daily basis than before. And they do look at every single complaint, and depending upon the nature of the complaint, they can choose to investigate patient complaints. So you want to make sure that you pay special attention to patient rights and know what they are, and make patient rights a strong part of your HIPAA security training for all of your staff, so your staff does not make a mistake in dealing with patient rights issues. Next slide, please. Been through this already, but just to reiterate, HIPAA has three important components: confidentiality, making sure that only people who need to see patient records see it; availability, the patient records are available to you when you need them in order to make clinical decisions; and integrity, the records have not been corrupted, so therefore the information you're looking at is valid and is useful. A breakdown in any of these is a HIPAA event. Only a breakdown in confidentiality is a breach. Next slide, please. Availability, basically, you want that chart to be available to you, that you can use it for medical decision making. This is an important part of HIPAA. HIPAA is about patient rights. Patients have a right to good care, and we cannot provide good care if the records are not available to us and to allow us to make the right decision for the patient at the time of care. Next slide, please. Availability can be impacted by a number of things. If you have a power outage and you have electronic medical records, then you're not going to be able to turn on your computers. So in order to protect the availability of your records, you may want to think about having battery backups on your computers so that way a power outage or a surge doesn't knock your computers out. If you're in an area that has frequent power outages, you may want to think about a backup generator. And these are the thoughts that have to go into play when you're determining what is my risk mitigation plan to protect the availability of my records. Now, we talked about scalable. If you have 1 or 2 power outages a year, you don't need a backup generator. It's not that vital. But if you have a lot of power outages, you may want to have it. If you're in a large group, it's more important for you to have that backup generator, because if you have a lot more medical records to address and you have more resources, because a large group has more resources than a smaller office, then 1 or 2 power outages may be enough of a reason to get that backup generator. So when we talk about resources, how much money would it take to do it, and how much effort would it take, and then how much impact would the event have on our patients? And all this comes into play when we make decisions as to what are we going to do to minimize the potential of this causing us a problem. Next slide, please. Other things that can impact availability is if you utilize the internet to connect to your records, and you have an internet provider that has frequent outages. You may want to think about having a backup internet connection, such as a MiFi through your electronic medical records, through your cell phone carrier, so that way if your hardwired connection to the internet goes down, you can access it over your cell phone network utilizing your laptop. If you have satellite offices that connect to a computer at the main office, you want to make sure that they also have those MiFi cards. Next slide, please. Also, you want to make sure that you keep your computers in good repair and well maintained, because if the computers break down, they're not going to work. You don't want to have coffee cups sitting on top of your computers, because if they spill, you've lost the computer and you don't have your data. So having rules like no coffee by the computers is part of your HIPAA plan to protect the computers. Do you have good antivirus software, and is it up to date? Because a virus attacking your computer affects not only availability, but potentially the integrity of your medical records. Do you have your operating system set up to automatically update security patches to protect you from a cyber criminal? Are your firewalls in your office properly configured to allow for data to flow through properly, but keep the crooks out? These are all things you need to look at. Next slide, please. Now, if we think about it, it's really not that difficult to do any of the things I mentioned. Battery backups, for example, you can go to Staples, Best Buy, or any computer store and buy a small battery backup to protect your computers for $49 or $59, maybe even less when they're on sale. Make sure your staff doesn't have coffee cups on the computers. Make sure if you're starting to get error messages from your computer, you bring in someone to repair them or replace them. Make sure that your routers are properly configured. If you need to bring in an IT consultant to set it up properly, please do so. If you're not familiar with it, let someone who knows what they're doing do it, because it's in your own best interest to have everything configured properly. Next slide, please. Now, what I want to do is understand the concept of resources. When we talk about resources, we're not talking about just money. We're talking about time. We're talking about your staff. We're talking about what you have to do in terms of technology, and do you have the ability, if you implement technology, to manage that technology properly. So we have to take all this into play, and you only have to do things that are within your resources. And if something is outside of your resources, you are not required to do it under the HIPAA rules and regulations. And your resources will vary. A small one-doctor office has very limited resources compared to a 50-doctor multi-specialty group. So you take that into play. If you see that the hospital is doing something, you don't have to do that. They've got an entire IT staff and a budget for this. You don't. So don't sit there and say, because someone else is doing it, I have to do it. Or say, well, I really don't have to do it. It's not within my resources, because you have to look at it and say, is it or is it not? What is it going to take? And you have to be able to defend your decisions should you have a HIPAA breach. Next slide, please. Now, the reasonable cause is what gives us that 30-day get-out-of-jail-free card. Reasonable cause is a legal concept. It's that something that happened, it was reasonable that it happened, it was reasonable that something went wrong. Let's talk about reasonable in terms of viruses. Let's just say you have antivirus software on your computers. Antivirus software works by having virus definitions. Now, in order for there to be a virus definition, that virus has to be found. That means someone got infected with that virus, and the people who wrote the antivirus software discovered the virus and then wrote a definition so that way other people in the future don't get infected by the virus. But someone had to get infected with it first. So somebody who had good antivirus software still got the virus. That is what's known as a reasonable cause violation. It was reasonable that it happened. Somebody took all the right steps, but they were unlucky. And that's why we have that 30-day get-out-of-jail-free card. Next slide, please. An inadvertent violation is a different type of violation. Something happened that you didn't expect and didn't plan for, and it caught you by surprise. It's not necessarily reasonable cause, because if you realized it could have happened, you could have prevented it. Inadvertent violations also have the 30-day get-out-of-jail-free card because you took a good faith effort, but you made a mistake. You're allowed to make a mistake. Next slide, please. Willful neglect violations, those are the ones you never want to have. Those are the ones that happen because you didn't bother taking the time to do a HIPAA risk analysis, do a mitigation plan, and put in steps to protect your data. Once again, willful neglect violations result in fines by law. Next slide, please. So we talked about the fines, but we have to understand how much can they be. Well, they can go up to $1.5 million per violation, no matter what. So if you have a willful neglect violation, you have mandatory fines. Reasonable cause, inadvertent, these type of violations, if you fix within 30 days, you cannot be fined. But if you do not fix them in a timely manner, you can still be fined. Now, when they fine you, they have a formula they use. The formula is based upon how many patients were impacted, what is the nature of the information that was released, what steps did you take to try and mitigate the damage, and how long did it take you to fix the problem, and finally, how many previous HIPAA violations have you had? All this will come into play when they determine how much a fine is. So a fine for the release of information from a podiatry office is probably going to be much less than if the same information was released by an HIV clinic, because the nature of the information is very, very different. So we are, to a certain degree, somewhat insulated from the worst possible fines, because generally speaking, the information we have in our computer is not as damaging to somebody's reputation as another type of practitioner. Next slide, please. And the bottom line is this, and I'm going to repeat this many times. As long as you are not in willful neglect, a proper response to the event can result in avoiding all fines. Next slide, please. So we want to make sure you're not in willful neglect. Hopefully everyone's got that by now, and hopefully you're tired of hearing it, but it's so important. Make sure you've done a HIPAA security risk analysis. Make sure you have your risk mitigation plan. Make sure you have followed through in implementing the items in your risk mitigation plan, which means that what you put in your risk mitigation plan must be things that are within your resources to do. Don't create a risk mitigation plan that is impossible for you to meet. Next slide, please. So we talked about HIPAA. We've talked about confidentiality. We've touched on availability and integrity. And let's continue on. Alan, next. So let's talk about other things that can impact availability. We talked about power, but natural disasters can affect availability. I happen to be in the Northeast, and a few years ago we had an event known as Sandy, which destroyed many medical offices. Many doctors completely lost all their records. Paper records were thoroughly destroyed. You get hurricanes in Louisiana that destroy the records. Florida has hurricanes. If your office has a fire and your records burn up and your computers burn up, that can cause problems with availability. The best thing you can do to protect the availability of your medical records is to have electronic medical records, to make sure those records are backed up on a regular basis, and to make sure those backups are stored off-site. The reason I say off-site backup is if you have your medical records in your office and you have your backup in your office and your office burns down, your medical records burn down and your backup just burned down. So off-site backup is huge in protecting the availability of your records. When I say off-site backup, you don't necessarily have to use an off-site backup service. You can back up your data to a flash drive and take it home with you so it's not in the office. That is also a very valid method of off-site backup. Next slide, please. We also want to make sure that we don't actually lose our computers, because if we lose our computers or they're stolen, not only do we have the potential of a breach because information's available to people who shouldn't have it because they have our computers, but any data on those computers, if they haven't been backed up, we have lost access to. Next slide, please. A fire, a hurricane, a natural disaster is something that can happen to any of us at any time. So we need to have something known as a disaster recovery plan. This is part of our HIPAA security risk analysis. Our disaster recovery plan is the steps that we're going to take should our office have a disaster and we need to reconstitute our records. Your disaster recovery plan is your Ghostbusters. Who are you going to call? So your disaster recovery plan includes reaching out to your EHR vendor to get the software reinstalled on a computer someplace, and then get your backup data installed onto that computer so suddenly you have access to your information. This is very, very important. Know what your disaster recovery plan is so that way you can maintain the availability of your patient records so that way you can serve your patients. Next slide, please. The next pillar of HIPAA is integrity. Integrity, the records are not corrupted. Records can get corrupted for a number of reasons. Our computers have hard drives in them. Those hard drives are physical devices that can wear out. If the data is damaged because a hard drive wears out, that can impact the integrity of your records. Something else that's much more common to affect the integrity of a record is human error. Let's just say you have two patients in your office by the name of Mary Smith. One Mary Smith comes in, and by accident, you put all the information into the wrong Mary Smith's file. The integrity of two charts has just been compromised. One chart is missing vital medical information, and the other chart has information that is not appropriate to the patient. We need to take steps to correct the integrity of both charts should this happen, and it happens on a regular basis. We need to go into the one that has the inappropriate data and redact that data. And I use the word redact, not delete, because that's a very important point. Those of you who are my age or older remember Watergate, where the issue was the time of blank space on the tape. Something that's missing, that's blank, it could be totally innocent, but the fact that no one knows what was there can be damning. So we don't want to ever erase patient data. Remember when we had paper records? When we wanted to remove something, we drew a single line through it, initialed it, and dated it? That's what redacting is. And when you redact information from your electronic medical record, you can always go back and see what was redacted. Therefore, the entire process is transparent. So should there be an audit, an investigation, or a malpractice case, they can't claim that you deleted anything to hide anything. Nothing is hidden. You made a mistake. You acknowledge it, but you are taking it away from the medical record so that way it's not there. Then you also have to go into the chart that's missing data and correct it and add that data back in. Next slide, please. Power surges can also cause problems with integrity, because if you get a power surge while your computer is writing, it can cause the data to be corrupted. So you don't want, that's another reason why you want to make sure that you have those battery backups, because a power surge can cause a problem, a hardware failure can cause a problem, and the backups will help you to recover from data integrity problems. So not only are backups important in terms of availability, but they help you to recover from a corrupted record, and therefore it's really even more important. Next slide, please. We talked about this. Human error is a major cause of damage to the integrity of the patient. Simply putting wrong lab results in the patient's chart or misplacing them or misfiling them hurts patient record integrity. We have to make sure that we are constantly vigilant to ensure that the records are kept in a complete manner. Next slide, please. So hopefully now you're beginning to see the HIPAA violations are much more than just breaches, and they can be caused by a number of things. People make mistakes, they do something improper. Our technology can fail and cause problems with HIPAA, or our computers either can be physically or virtually stolen with data getting out of our hands. So there are lots of things that can cause HIPAA violations that we want to prevent. Next slide, please. To prevent it, we're going to put in 3 types of measures: physical measures, technical measures, and administrative measures. Next slide, please. Physical measures are the steps we take to make sure that our computers are physically protected. Physical measures can be making sure that our computers are in locked rooms. They can be making sure that we have alarm systems in case someone breaks in. They can be making sure that our screens are positioned in such a way that somebody walking by the desk can't glance over the desk and see patient information they shouldn't see. These are all physical measures that we can do to protect our data. And so you have to look and see, what can I do physically to protect our data, whether it be locks on the doors, positioning, etc. Next slide, please. What you want to do is you want to look at your office and see how you can do things. Do you want to have fire alarms, fire suppression systems, locks on the doors, privacy screens on the monitors? Keeping your computers, copiers, and fax machines out of public areas. Because if we print out a piece of paper and someone can walk by it and grab it that should not, that can cause a breach. So this all comes into play when we talk about physical measures to protect patient data. Next slide, please. Technical measures have to do with the technology. When people think about HIPAA, very often they do a lot to protect the technical aspects of it, and they really don't do the physical administrative. But the technical measures include making sure your antivirus software is up and running. Make sure that you keep up to date with software updates for your EHR system, software updates for your operating system. Renew your virus each year. Make sure that your firewalls and access points are properly configured, and keeping your computers in good repair. Next slide, please. Confidentiality, we want to make sure, we talked about this, we want to make sure though that confidentiality is always, always at the forefront. Now, you may have heard stories about celebrities who were admitted to hospitals, and people in the hospitals browsing the celebrities' records because they were curious. Your EHR systems have log files in them. Those log files are there as part of the certification process. They have to be there or the software cannot be certified. And those log files will say who viewed the record, when they viewed it, and will allow an administrator to view the log files and determine if you have looked at records that you should not. So if you have friends, neighbors, or family members that come to the practice, if you don't have a good business reason to be in their charts, do not go in there, because that's even a HIPAA violation. So make sure that you don't do things improper with medical records. Another thing that happens is social engineering. Social engineering is somebody convincing you that they need information to help one of your patients. So even in the case where a husband calls and says, my wife's in a lot of pain, she just had surgery, and calls for information on what to do, If the wife has not given the husband permission to access the data, and you give information to the husband, you've actually committed a violation of the confidentiality of that patient's data. And if it turns out that the wife and husband are going through a nasty divorce, and the husband's calling to get information to use in that divorce, you're going to have a lot of explaining to do. So always make sure when somebody calls and asks for patient information that you have on record patient's permission to share the information with that individual. Next slide, please. Most people, when they think about HIPAA, only think about the confidentiality. But you have to remember that the other two items, availability and integrity, are just as important. And don't never forget patient rights under HIPAA. Patients have a right to a copy of their medical records. Patients have a right to an electronic copy of their medical records. Patients have a right to tell you that they don't want their medical records shared with an insurance company if they pay for it themselves. Patients have a right to request that you make changes to their medical records. You don't have to comply with that request, but when they make that request, you have to accept the request. That request becomes part of their record, and you must respond to the request. And if a patient feels their rights have been violated, they can file a complaint. A patient also has the right to receive something known as the Notice of Privacy Practices. This Notice of Privacy Practices is the document that outlines your policies and procedures regarding their privacy. And if a patient walks up and asks for it, you must provide it to them. And if you do not, you have violated their HIPAA rights. So please make sure you have copies of your Notice of Privacy Practices at the front desk to provide to patients upon request. It's a good idea to have a copy of this document posted in your waiting room, and it's a good idea to have a copy of this document on your practice website should you have a practice website. Next slide, please. Now, when it comes to HIPAA, there are some things that we must do, and there are some things we must address. And this is where the concept of reasonable comes into play. Now, 5 years ago, encryption of your data was something that was addressable. And in fact, in the law, it still says encryption is addressable. And 5 years ago, encryption was technically difficult, and it was expensive to have encryption software. Fast forward to today. Encryption is no longer technically difficult, and it is no longer expensive. So we still have to address the issue of encryption. 5 years ago, we could have addressed encryption by saying, we've looked at encryption, and it is beyond our resources to encrypt our data. Today, you cannot say that because it's not beyond your resources. And this is one of the reasons why you have to repeat your HIPAA security risk analysis each year. Because each year, there are things that become available to you because of decreases in price and decreases in the complexity of implementing those measures. So you have to look at it each year and see, okay, I couldn't do it last year because it was beyond my resources. Maybe I can do it this year. I'd definitely be able to do it next year. And this is one of the reasons you have to repeat your HIPAA security risk analysis each and every year. Because even if nothing in your office has changed per se, the threats that exist out there are constantly changing. Ransomware is a huge threat right now. It wasn't a big threat 3 years ago. So you have to address ransomware now more than you had to 3 years ago. So, and the resources available to you are also constantly changing. Next slide, please. What you want to do when you do your HIPAA risk analysis is identify what risks exist, what you can do, and then you prioritize the steps you're going to take. How do you prioritize? Well, you look at, do I have the resources to do this? If something goes wrong here, how bad is it? How many patients will be affected? What will be the impact on those patients? How much harm will be done? And you look at this, and things that affect a lot of patients should take a lot more priority than things that might affect one patient. Things that are inexpensive take more priority than things that are less expensive. Things that are risks to sensitive data take a lot more priority to things that are not at risk to sensitive data. And that's how we come up with our risk mitigation plan, and we order it, and we do things that are the highest priority first and lowest priority last. Next slide, please. So what we want to do is now start to tie this all together. Think about where your data is in your office. On what computers does it exist, and on what forms of paper does it exist? Think about the nature of the data. Think about the computers, the physical computers that store the data, the software programs that touch the data, the people who use these programs. And you start to think about, okay, how can I implement physical, technical, and administrative measures to make sure that my technology is in the best possible state, my people know what to do, and the office is configured in such a way that the chance of something going wrong is minimized. Next slide, please. As I said before, concentrate your resources where it's going to do the most good. Address issues that will impact the most patients or have the most damage. Those are the highest priority items. Next slide, please. Make sure you protect the availability. Backups should be a huge priority item. Now, many people back up once a day, and they have 1, 2, or 3 flash drives that they back up to and rotate them. That is not a good regular backup procedure, because if you get data corrupted today and you notice it 2 weeks ago, you don't have a backup from 2 weeks ago to recover that. So you wanted to have a regular backup program, and a backup program where you have a good data retention policy. Keep those backups off-site because you don't want your office burning down with the backups. And keep the names and phone numbers of your Ghostbusters, your hardware and software consultants, available to help you should you have a disaster and need to get one of those backups up and running. Next slide, please. Keep your computers in good repair because you want to make sure that they're always available and can turn on. Now, forget about all the medical records which we're talking about, but imagine you had a disaster and it affected your billing program and you lost all your billing data. How would that impact your practice? So even if you're not worried about your medical records, think about your billing data because that is your financial livelihood. Next slide, please. Availability is not only important for HIPAA, it's important for you in order to provide quality of care to your patients, and it's important for you in order to provide financial continuity to your practice. Next slide. Integrity, once again, make sure your records have integrity. Make sure they're correct, they're intact and complete so you can use them for clinical decision making in order to provide the best possible care to your patients. Next slide. We're talking now a little bit about some of the administrative measures that you can put into place that comes in place with HIPAA. Administrative measures are simply the policies and procedures that you and your staff follow in the process of HIPAA compliance. Administrative measures include what people can and cannot do on the computers, how people can use them, what access they have to have strong passwords or not. These are things to do, but administrative measures are the most difficult ones because they require people to remember what to do and do the right things, and it requires that you train your staff. The majority of HIPAA violations are due to human error because of breakdowns in the administrative procedures and administrative controls related to HIPAA. Next slide, please. It's almost impossible, in fact, it is impossible, to be bulletproof. Things can and will go wrong. And don't expect that just because you've done it right, something won't go wrong. Something will. But understanding they can go wrong and understanding the steps to take when something goes wrong will allow you to get through a HIPAA event with a minimum amount of stress and aggravation. Next slide, please. Bottom line is this. The federal government has come out and said when people have a HIPAA violation, not if. They expect that every doctor in this country will have a HIPAA violation, and they expect that many have already, and many of those who have don't even know it. So since they expect that we will have a violation, we can't expect that we're not going to have one. It's going to happen. Just be prepared for it. Next slide. So this is why the government has set up the rules such that if you act in good faith and you document what you did, you can minimize the potential damage to your practice should you have a HIPAA event. Next slide. We talked about this earlier. If you have an event, you can avoid a fine by processing it within 30 days. If you do have a fine, it's going to be impacted by how quickly did you address the problem? Have you had previous HIPAA violations? How many patients were impacted? What was the nature of the information? Did you cooperate with the investigators? Were you in willful neglect? And remember, the fines can range anywhere from $0 to $1.5 million. Another point to take with the fines, the government is not looking to put you out of business. The government will fine you the most they can without making your practice shut down. So they're going to look at your financial status also when determining how to fine. And if you feel the fine is unjustified, there is a process to appeal the fines. Next slide. You want to review your HIPAA security plan regularly. You want to update your HIPAA risk analysis and your HIPAA risk mitigation plan on an annual basis. You want to look at the threats each year. You want to look at the resources you have available each year and modify your plan and make sure that you follow through with your mitigation plan. Because if you follow through with your HIPAA risk mitigation plan, then you cannot say, what if nothing has changed in my practice? Because each year something should change, because as part of your mitigation plan, you're making changes. And that's one of the reasons you have to repeat the process each and every year. Next slide, please. So repeat it annually. Make sure that your plan each year reflects the changes of the previous year and get it properly documented. Next slide. Already said this. If you say, but what if nothing in my office has changed? If nothing in your office has changed, then you have not followed through on your HIPAA risk mitigation plan, and you're likely to be in what the government calls willful neglect because you're only giving HIPAA lip service. Make sure you follow your mitigation plan each and every year. Do your HIPAA risk analysis. That way, should something happen and should there be investigation, they do not find you to be in willful neglect. You must keep copies of your HIPAA security manuals each and every year for 7 years, and they should show a progression for year to year, increasing your security, so that way you can show that you are in a continuous quality improvement program of improving the availability, integrity, and confidentiality of the patient data in your office. Next slide, please. Please remember, it is a continuous quality improvement program. It's not a one and done. It's not like the OSHA manual where you do it, you put it on your shelf, and it sits there. It's a living document, and as you make changes in the office, you update your HIPAA plan and HIPAA risk analysis to reflect the changes you did. So if you have a risk mitigation plan and you fix one of those items on December 22nd tomorrow, you go into the book and you initial that you did that December 22nd and you date it. Next slide, please. You don't have to spend huge amounts of money. You don't have to spend an excessive amount of time, but you do have to do something, and you have to document what you did in order to demonstrate that you are being compliant with HIPAA. Next slide. HIPAA relates to the quality of care you give, because once again, we talked about this. The availability of your data and the integrity of your data is important in order for you to provide quality care at the point of service, because if you don't have good data, it's hard to make a good medical decision. Not only do you rely on that data, but the doctors that you share your medical records with when you send out information are going to rely on the integrity and the correctness of the data that you share with them. Next slide. So think about the integrity of your records. Continue. Just go right through this, please, Alan. If the integrity of your records is compromised, not only does it affect your care, but it affects the quality of care that anybody you send your records to has. Next slide. Continue. Okay, just go through this. Availability, we talked about that. Okay, continue. And the confidentiality, we've really beat this one up, but make sure you understand it. If someone does not have a need to see the records, they should not see them, even if they work in your office. Next slide. Here are some resources that are there from HIMSS, from the Office for OIG is the Office for Inspector General, and from various lawyers who deal with that. So here are some very good resources if you want to do additional reading on HIPAA and the impact it can have on your patients and on your office. Next slide. Any questions? You can contact me. That's my email address, mbrody@tldsystems.com. You can contact Collaborative Practice Solutions, and they can put you in touch with me. And my direct phone line is on the phone, 631-403-6687. So, Alan, do we have any questions there?
So we just actually, Mike, and thank you so much for this. It was very, very informative. Just a couple. Can I assume that all this information is applicable not only to 2016 but to 2017?
This information has been applicable since 2009 and will continue onward. This is all law and has not changed. The only thing that changes are the threats that exist to our data and the resources we have to protect our data.
Another question was, should I be using a managed network firewall?
A managed network firewall, it depends on the size of your organization. A managed network firewall is simply one that provides you with the ability to log in and make changes to it. Most network firewalls these days, even the less expensive ones, are manageable and can be a managed network firewall. So it depends on how much you want to do in configuring and your network. If you want to be able to say, my staff, I don't want them going to Gmail. I don't want them going to Yahoo. You can go into the firewall and block those sites. They're nice things to have if you feel they're issues. But you can also simply tell your staff, don't go to these websites. You're not allowed to. So that's the difference between, shall we say, a technical measure, which is the blocking the websites, and an administrative measure telling your patients that they should not be going to the websites. So yes, if you feel it's important, go ahead and use it. Is it required? No, but it's a nice thing to have.
Thanks. And lastly, somebody wants to know, should they have a shredder on site?
A shredder on site, that depends how much shredding are you going to do. If you have large amounts of shredding, you might want to use a shredding service and simply have a lockbox where you put your papers in and have them come and shred it once a week or once a month. Or you may want to have a shredder on site. If you're going to use an on-site shredder, I strongly recommend utilizing a cross-cut shredder because they're much more effective than the simple strip shredders. But once again, that's a decision. Does it make sense for you or not? I happen to have a shredder on site in my personal office.
Great. So just to finish up, Mike, I just have a couple of slides here that I made up, and I took what the short blurb was for meaningful use objective number 1 as it pertains to if you want to and are participating with meaningful use, which is what HIPAA is a component of. And you can see how difficult the government has made it just to understand exactly where you'd have to go and read and look. So why it's so important to use somebody like Mike and TLD Systems in order to help you make sure that you are HIPAA compliant and also do your security risk analysis. We strongly suggest that this is done by an outside company like TLD Systems. And I think Mike could probably agree with me that historically that the security risk analysis and HIPAA problems with HIPAA have been one of the main reasons that physicians have failed post-payment audits as it pertains to the meaningful use incentive. So I strongly recommend using Mike's company in order to be compliant. Now, if you are going to be attesting for meaningful use, the attestation period opens on January 3rd and runs through February 28th. Collaborative Practice Solutions has a program known as Attestation Made Easy, where one of our consultants will log on to the CMS website with you and take you step by step, making sure you enter your data into the website in the correct fashion. We've been doing this for several years, helping you walk through the steps and just taking the burden off of you and making it less stressful. The cost on the Attestation Made Easy program is $299 for 1 to 3 physicians in your practice. And if you're interested, please contact sales at collaborativepracticesolutions.com. And one thing I want to leave everybody with this evening is, if you are, and since you all are on this call, TRAKnet clients, TLD Systems is set up directly to work with you. When you log in, they will know there is a portal directly for all TRAKnet clients. And we will get this information to you. I forgot to make a slide for this, but if everybody wants to write down traknet.tldsystems.com. That way, Dr. Brody and TLD Systems will know that you are a TRAKnet client and will receive a nice discount on what would normally be paid. In addition, if you are not only a TRAKnet client, but also a PICA client, for your malpractice, you'll receive even a further discount on top of that. So, Mike, any closing thoughts this evening?
Yes, for those people who are attesting for meaningful use, CMS is looking to see that you did your risk analysis prior to the end of your attestation period. The very last day of your attestation period for 2016 can be December 31st of 2016. So they will be looking, if they do an audit and they see your security risk analysis was not done prior to the end of your attestation period, they will not accept it as part of the audit process. And as Alan said, not having a valid HIPAA security risk analysis is the most common reason for failure for a meaningful use audit. Approximately 25% of all doctors who were audited failed for that reason, including DPMs.
All right, well, we've pressed up right after 9 p.m. this evening. Mike, I want to thank you so much for your time and more your expertise in this matter. As a practicing podiatrist, I know that this is very difficult to understand, and appreciate having somebody like you to look to as an expert. So I want to thank you for your time and expertise this evening, and with that, we will adjourn for the evening. So everybody have a good night and a happy and a healthy holiday season. Thank you very much. Good night.